The titanic struggle between Rome and Carthage spanned over a century, starting in 265 BC, down to the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. It was witness to one of the largest naval battles in world history, incredible feats of daring, and legendary figures on both sides. It would take until the early modern era before states could assemble the resources to wage war on the scale they did during these wars. Fleets of more than 300 warships were routine, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers would serve on both sides. Some of the campaigns in these wars are still studied at military academies around the world. The human cost was tragic, with the Romans losing 50,000 legionnaires in a single battle, for example. Casualties were not restricted to only soldiers either. Many civilians were massacred when either side had to storm a city or town. By the end of the conflict, Carthage was extinguished, their culture and history almost entirely erased. These wars would lead Rome to dominate the Mediterranean basin for the next 5 centuries. Legend has it that Carthage was founded by the legendary Queen Dido of Tyre, which was a Phoenician city, in 814 BC. This wasn't the first Phoenician settlement in the area, but over the centuries, Carthage would come to be the leading city in North Africa. The city's population was bolstered by Phoenicians that fled the destruction in the wake of the campaigns of Alexander the Great. Carthage was a mercantile state, with trade being the cornerstone of their society. By the year 300, Carthage had become the premier power in the Western Mediterranean, controlling more territory than Rome itself. Carthage had a political system that had elements of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, giving it a high level of social stability that was the envy of many, especially the Greeks in their chronically unstable city-states. Rome is a city that needs no introduction. By the year 300, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the River Po, but it had not yet ventured outside the peninsula itself. Rome at this time was also a republic, with magisterial elections being held annually. Although Roman patricians had outsized influence in society, the Roman lower classes were also represented in government. The 3 wars would produce some legendary figures on both sides. On the Roman side, there was Fabius Maximus, the man who saved the Republic during its darkest hour. Marcus Claudius Marcellus would also emerge as a Roman hero and earn the title Sword of Rome for killing a Gallic king in single combat. For this, he would be the 3rd man to earn Rome's highest honour, the Spolia Opima, or Spoils of Honour. Only Romulus himself and another military tribune had earned the honour before him, and none would earn it after him. Then there's the Scipio family, who played a leading role in all 3 conflicts, and the most prominent of them, Scipio Africanus, is sometimes remembered as the greatest general Rome ever produced. On the Carthaginian side, the most charismatic figures are all members of the Barcid family, especially Hamilcar, who kept the first Punic War going in Sicily without suffering defeat. Then there's Hannibal. Hannibal has the kind of reputation that very few men in history have attained. His march across the Alps and the battles he fought in Italy are epics in themselves. Napoleon himself named Hannibal one of the great captains of history. Von Schlieffen, the German architect of the offensive into France in 1914, consciously attempted to reproduce the genius of Hannibal's tactics on an enormous scale. There were non-Romans and Carthaginians as well, like Hiero, the wily ruler of Syracuse, as well as Massinissa, the great Numidian king who was still leading his men in battle well into his 80s. There were also some great minds, like Archimedes of Syracuse, the Greek polymath that helped defend his cities from the Romans, as well as Polybius. Polybius was a Greek statesman and historian who wound up as a prisoner in Rome. He became close to the Scipio family and so had a front row seat to the conflict, which is why he is our primary source for most of the war. It was the Punic Wars that first led the Romans to begin writing their own history. Others too realised the importance of the wars, and the Greeks especially produced narratives of the conflict, trying their best to explain Rome's rapid rise to supremacy. The Mediterranean world in the late 3rd century BC was influenced by the death of Alexander in 323. The Ptolemies of Egypt, the Seleucids of Syria and much of Asia, and the Antigonid Kingdom of Macedonia. Greek communities occupied most of Sicily and southern Italy, otherwise known as Magna Graecia. The Greeks on Sicily would be in almost continual conflict with Carthage for centuries before the Punic War began. The Hellenistic city-states were the most technically sophisticated fighting forces in the Mediterranean. Greek city-states all modelled themselves on the armies of Philip and Alexander. Carthage abandoned this practice, since their population was too small. Only if Carthage itself was threatened would their citizens take up arms. It is often said that the Carthaginians relied exclusively on mercenaries, which isn't exactly true. The Carthaginians, like the Romans, had a network of allies and vassals, many of which they recruited for their armies, which were led by Carthaginian generals. The Romans, by contrast, relied on a citizen militia. They also had a much larger population, so could field more and larger armies than Carthage. They were led by Roman magistrates. They didn't fight in the manner of the Greeks, with the leaders in the front lines, but they were expected to be in the thick of fighting, giving orders and manoeuvring their soldiers. They were also the only state that used reserves extensively, and also relied on allies for support and cavalry. The reason they are called the Punic Wars, and not the Carthaginian Wars, is because the Romans called them Punicus, a Latinized version of Phoenician. It essentially means the war against Carthage. There are no surviving accounts from the Punic side, only by Greeks such as Sosilas, who was Hannibal's tutor, who are favourable to the Carthaginians. Consequently, this is a story about Rome's war against a Punic enemy.